Good morning. My name is Keenan Miller, and I'd like to welcome you to Metro Talks, a series of public forums to seed and exchange ideas on how the Bay Area can transform for the better. I want to acknowledge at the top of our session that we're having this call from our perches around the Bay Area, which is Ohlone land. I also want to recognize the outrage, protest, and activism taking place around the Bay and the country after the public murder of George Floyd. The strife we see signals the importance of the necessary conversations we need to have about how to rebuild a better Bay Area where everyone thrives, regardless of skin color. Today, we'll be exploring housing, an area with its own dark history of racial exclusion, and how policy challenges that were already at crisis levels before the pandemic are looking as we wade our way through the public health and economic crisis of COVID-19. Some quick housekeeping items. All attendees are muted and will be able to ask questions via the Q&A box throughout the session, with questions answered in the second half. Depending on time, we may field questions from attendees on the phone who will be able to raise their digital hands by pressing *9. And just some basic agreements. Be mindful that there are many voices in this space and to be respectful and graceful with each other during a challenging time for all. Just going to quickly check out the results from the poll, which shows about nearly half of the folks that are calling in are from Alameda County. And the vast majority have said COVID-19 has impacted their housing circumstances. And we have one person on the phone and almost everybody else on Zoom. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to MTC-ABAG's Executive Director, Therese McMillan, who will be moderating this session. Therese.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased and privileged that you are here joining us this morning. As Keenan noted, I'd like to, first again affirm that the context of today is irrevocably shaped by the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. Coupled with the disparate deaths that our communities of color are facing with COVID-19, you just have to hold and own that America's vast inequities persist in so many areas. Our criminal justice system, our economy, transportation, land use planning, and housing that we'll be talking about today. And so it is with the urgency of the need for transformation and systemic change in mind that I'm incredibly proud to be putting on this new remote series of Metro Talks, recognizing the need to reflect and think critically about how communities that make up the 9-county Bay Area need to respond together to the historic challenges that we are facing. And through it all, to lift up equity as a shared vision of just and fair inclusion into the Bay Area, where everyone can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So we're excited to kick off these conversations with 3 experts in today's conversation on rebuilding a better Bay, advancing equitable housing throughout COVID-19. Each will share their unique perspectives on how housing is being impacted in the Bay and why that matters. Conor Dougherty is a technology and economics reporter for the New York Times and author of Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. Conor grew up in the Bay Area, leaving to study chemistry at UC San Diego and embarking on a journalism career across California and the nation. He spent 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, where he covered recreational sports, housing, and the economy before joining the Gray Lady in 2014 as a tech reporter. Conor lives in Oakland with his family and is an avid skateboarder. Lorena Melgarejo is the executive director of Faith in Action, a network of congregations and community leaders working to ensure that the dignity of all people in our community is upheld. Lorena was born in Paraguay. She immigrated to the US in 1993 and lived the first decade of her life in the United States as an undocumented immigrant. This experience, along with her faith, led her to become a community organizer. She has spent the last 2 decades working with labor, community, and faith organizations to build a movement for social, racial, and economic justice. Her work has been focused on inviting the people who are closest to the pain into leadership and to speak with their voice to be agents of change and organizing. She lives in San Francisco in the Mission with her 11-year-old daughter. And our third speaker is Stephen Falk. Stephen spent the last 3 decades serving 5 California cities, most recently as Oakland's interim city administrator. He was given the Bay Area Metro Award by MTC-ABAG in 2019 for vocal support of dense and transit-oriented housing in the region to address climate change, income inequality, and housing affordability. And he became the first city manager to receive that award. Stephen has a bachelor's degree from Reed College, master's in public policy from Harvard University, and an electrified baby blue 1961 Volkswagen Beetle. He is currently lecturing at UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. So again, a quick reminder before we begin the conversation, audience members will use the Q&A box for questions to the speakers and the staff. As moderator, I'm committed to maintaining a safe container for sharing our thoughts and ideas, and I'll be coordinating with my colleague Leslie, who will be curating the questions for the Q&A session. So let's get on with the questions. So the first one is for all of you to answer, and we'll rotate. And it's this: what do you see as the intersections between racial justice, COVID-19, and the housing affordability crisis in the Bay Area? Conor, let's start with you, and particularly given the reflections and great work you did in your book.
Well, as I said in the intro to the book, which was of course written before COVID-19, but that every problem in America is at many of our most pressing problems are at some level a housing problem. Segregation is pretty much by definition a housing problem. Access to schools and access to good jobs without having to endure, a 3-hour commute is a housing problem. And climate change is not entirely a housing problem, but figuring out how to reduce vehicle miles traveled is a crucial piece of climate change. And on top of that, I think that, speaking more about today's, kind of what you opened with your comments and the things we're living through today, if you look at wealth disparities between races, particularly Black and white people, housing accounts for most of it. So our wealth gap is generally, for the most part, is a housing wealth gap. And so I think that, housing cannot in any way, shape, or form be separated from all these issues, because this really deep question, where we live and who do we live near and who are we comfortable around, is encapsulated in, all this federal housing policy. Obviously we've all talked about redlining, in my book, and in, so many people have talked about this truly putrid decision the federal government made to forcibly segregate people through financial policy. And to some extent, if you read the discussions of that contemporaneously in the 40s, people just didn't believe anybody would want to buy a house if it was in a mixed neighborhood. So this notion who we can or would be comfortable around and encapsulated through housing policy is everything. And I'll just add on top of that, in addition to all sorts of other disparities, one of the reasons Black and Latino, particularly Latino tenants in the Bay Area have higher rates of COVID-19 is that they're in more crowded housing, which is a reflection of wealth disparity. So it's everything, I would say.
And with that, let me shift this question to Lorena. And again, you've probably more than any of us seen this play out and manifest itself in communities, firsthand. What are your thoughts on this intersection of housing affordability crisis, racial justice, and COVID-19, and how COVID-19 has maybe just changed things dramatically?
So definitely what Conor referred to is exactly what we're seeing every day in the field, right? In the community. I work in San Francisco and San Mateo, and I mean, the heart of our work is actually to have people who are directly impacted, so residents and tenants, to build committees, to talk to other tenants and other residents. And since the shelter in place started, we have committees in probably 9 cities, and they're small committees, mostly Latina women, immigrants, and they have made phone calls to about 3,000 other immigrant Latino families just to check in with them and see what's happening. And the stories that are being heard and reflected are, there is a connection between civil rights and housing. Housing is central to belonging to a place. And for that place, not only to claim that place as a home, but that place claiming you back is central to feeling at home. So for our families, I think everything that we know already, people who are poorer, people who are immigrants, we're getting the most sick because we have to go out and work to try to make ends meet. Rent has not been made for a few months. That creates all this anxiety, has people going to lending institutions that charge huge rates just to try to make ends meet. And that's amounting into, basically, we're kicking the can down the road of a huge amount of debt for folks that's been accumulated, anxiety, everything. So beyond just the COVID-19 issue, we're seeing people of color really being impacted in a different way, in a deeper way, not just for right now, but for the future, not for themselves, but also for their families. What is this gonna mean in the next few years? Is in our hands to see what we're gonna do also. The silver lining, I think, of this, and as an organizer and as a person of faith, is important to see what are we to learn, what's the hope within this, is that this whole issue around shelter in place showed and made it clear for everyone, something that we have been talking about as the necessity of having a home and a shelter, a place where we can be safe, as central not just to the health of the particular family, but as public health in general. So that's something that's hopeful, because it's starting to become something that all of us, whether you're a homeowner or a renter or you live in the streets, everybody shares now that sense that we know that homes are important. And I find hope in that, because we can have new conversations from a different place now.
And that's just such an important place to start in terms of that connection, because shelter in place assumes you have a place, as you've said. And I think we have seen that is not an equally accessible outcome for people. And Stephen, let me turn to you. You and I, have been in the public sector in government that now is going to have to figure out, how do we move forward, and how do we not move forward, leaving behind again those that have been most impacted in this space? What thoughts, what do you have thoughts on that and reflections on how we might do better? Oh, you need to unmute, Steve.
Thank you. So I'll just say that it's imperative that we as public managers and officials work together to address this issue. This brutal combination of a housing affordability crisis and a pandemic and the worst racial unrest in a generation has knocked all of us off our stools. And like so many others, I'm grieving. I'm sitting here as a white male and someone who's benefited from a lifetime of privilege. And I may not be the person that people would normally look to for knowledge on this topic, but white people need to act as allies. And so I concluded several years ago that even if I just have the tiniest spotlight or amplifier or power source, that I should use that to promote better justice, and we should all do that. And so with that, I'd say this is not somebody else's problem. This is my problem. It's your problem. It's our problem. It's something we need to work on together. And I think this, you talked earlier about the intersection. This pandemic has exacerbated income inequality and inequality generally. It's allowed knowledge workers to stay at home and bank savings while retail or restaurant workers, who are often disproportionately Black and brown, and Uber drivers and artists are laid off and let go, and they're burning through their meager savings. And so this is a really terrible situation, something we need to work together on.
So thank you for that. And Lorena, you were, speaking to what, really is occurring at the grassroots level. Are there other thoughts that you can offer about how we can better have our communities at the grassroots level really be brought into the decision-making for change? I think that's a critical element, because if we don't, make that connection, if the voices aren't linked to the power and the decision-making, that obviously is and has been for decades very problematic. So from where you sit in the work that you've been doing, do you have some thoughts about how that might be different given the current circumstances?
It's interesting because, again, going back to the shelter in place, and now with more and more control around the places that we can be and cannot be, both for our health, both for, public safety or whatever it may be. There is a tendency for people to be more isolated in their pain. When we talk about civic engagement, we're a couple of months away from major elections at the local level, state and national level. And right now, everything is pushing people in a way apart. The moment that we're in right now with the efforts that just came up recently in all of the Bay to extend the moratoriums on evictions, to expand them, so that people can remain home, can have that safety. I think I have brought a lot of folks who are directly impacted into civic life, right? Going to the city halls, going to the board of supervisors, speaking their truth, writing in the newspapers, doing, safe actions. There's something about that now with this moment, frankly, to honor Mr. Floyd's martyrdom in public. It was something that has been happening over and over for forever in this country since the making of it. And the thing is, he was choked to death in front of all of us. But frankly, our communities have been choked slowly in different ways through policies. And the fact that young people, the fact that all of us are being called into coming out, saying something about it, these are opportunities for all of us in the different levels, wherever it is that people work. We can either heed the call to come together and reinvent who we're gonna become, or we can go towards that tendency to isolation. And it is in the hands of public government. It is in the hand of our faith congregations. It's in the hands of schools, of us as organizers to actually hold space and create ways in which people need to lean into this with their own stories. Because either we as people who are directly impacted participate, or somebody else is gonna write it for us. Somebody else is gonna prescribe a solution. And it might be an okay solution, it might be an awful solution, but it's not gonna be directly our interests, the ones that are gonna lead that solution. So, I mean, clearly I'm a community organizer. That's what I do every day, is invite people into that conversation. And what makes me hopeful is that I see more and more people from different sides, whether people are so quote unquote directly impacted or can pretend like they're not impacted, be it homeowners or people who are white and have more education and more money. I think that there's this moment right now that there's a new fire in people's belly to recreate who we are as a country. And that's an opportunity. We have an opportunity as we're coming into this new moment to try things that are new.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful you brought up the observation, as we all are seeing, that this is happening again across the country. Conor, and you know, I'm kind of reordering the questions we were all considering, but I think this is really, the thread is really helpful. You know, what lessons can the Bay Area learn from other parts of the country in addressing housing affordability? I said something, the Bay Area sometimes can exist in its own bubble in terms of our perspectives, that we're all laughing, as we all know that that's true. But in the research that you've done and the reporting that you've done, while there might not be the perfect silver bullet out there, what are there lessons about whether it's the engagement and the effective work of community voice in public decision making or in housing policy itself? What might you share there?
So I'll share a couple of things, on the policy front and everything. But I think that when we talk about housing, and we have a lot of very entrenched political fights over housing, and they get very technical, it's kind of two big questions. And they're different in different cities, but they're two very, very big questions for housing. And they often get conflated with each other, but they don't have to be the same question. One question is, how much housing do we have relative to like the jobs, right? And then the other question is, who owns it? And I think a lot of times you will see people who are very concerned with the who owns it side of the question, fighting with the people who are we should build more of it side of the question. That's good, that's a healthy tension, but I'm just saying that they don't have to be the same question. But on the whole, we're healthy if people are working on both of those questions. Anyway, so what we've seen in other parts, so one of the things I kind of became an operating principle for my book is there's not a lot of new solutions that people have discovered. And so the question is less about finding a solution and more about what prevents us from implementing solutions, what prevents us from finding some common cause. And I think that we've seen, so these solutions are, you need more housing. You can't just build a skyscraper and then build no housing near it, or else you're going to create a problem, which is essentially what we've done in the Bay Area. But then the other, so that's one thing. But then also, you know, there are some people whose wages do not cover the cost of housing. That's even true in very poor rural areas, but it's especially true here. And so you need some sort of mechanism. It could be rent control. It could be, you know, whatever, but some sort of direct support for a tenant that gives them some of the, or much of the security that a homeowner would get. You know what I mean? That they have some reasonable prediction of what their cost will be. They're not just going to get, as I kind of talked about in my book, an $800 rent increase out of nowhere, which happened to one of the families in my book. So when I look at other places, I think so Oregon, for instance, passed, you know, a mild rent control, statewide rent control law with, but paired it with like basically the end of single family zoning. So you're allowing the opportunity for people to potentially build more high density housing in exclusive school districts and stuff like that. But you're also giving tenants who are where they are now some, I mean, again, it was a pretty mild law, but you know, some price protection. And then Minneapolis just actually passed, basically became the first major city in America to get rid of single family zoning. And I guess one of the things I thought, so I guess what I'm saying is that in other places we've seen more coalition between the who owns the housing and how much housing should we build sides of the equation. And I basically don't believe that unless those two sides come together and find a better way to create a new coalition, it doesn't have to be kumbaya, but it has to be some kind of even solution, then I just don't see how we're going to get anywhere. But that's really hard because to some extent, though people don't like thinking about it this way, it requires like breaking old coalitions. And anyway, so at some level, I guess what I would say, anyway, so what do we need to do? We need to like find a way to make housing more affordable for people who can't afford it, which is subsidies or rent control. And we need to like build more housing. I think all the solutions are great, but figuring out how we get people together to really come together on solutions, and giving a little on both sides, you know, is I think is important. Now, I should just add, this term both sides can become kind of a cop-out sometimes, like, you know, with policing or something like that. But I do think in housing, you are going to have more compromise. I mean, some people have been in a place a long time. Some people are coming to it for, you know, are coming from other places, you know, and for jobs. You know, some people are, anyway, just getting started. Some people have been in a place a long, you know, or been a long-time homeowner in a place, and the relative interests of those people is just going to have to be hashed out in a way that is a little bit more nuanced than something as, you know, pretty black and white like policing.
You know, I want to take that notion. We may actually have the tools. It's just how well we're using them and what are the coalitions that need to be built in order to use them better. I'm going to, you know, take that premise and Steve, ask you again, how do we move forward in that space? And reflecting again, particularly, it's hard normally, and we're in an unprecedented economic crisis right now as a result of COVID-19. And part of our challenge is always juggling these, you know, competing priorities. Is there a way that, you know, how do you have some ideas of how we can continue to have housing at the front end of these priorities and maybe change the conversation competing to complementing, and particularly given resources being so dire?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think of myself kind of as a relentlessly optimistic person, and I'm going to choose to be optimistic now and suggest that if our immunologists and virologists are good and do a great job, which I think they will have effective therapies, and they'll have an immunization for COVID-19, but it may take a couple of years. And so what that means is we're in this kind of narrow window, hopefully narrow window, where right now the virus is particularly dangerous. It's deadly. And so I think as local government professionals, our first priority, and this is if we have limited resources, we should be spending those resources on keeping people safe and keeping people from dying. And what that means is finding housing units for people who are at risk, people who are living in unsanitary homeless clusters, or people who are living in particularly crowded units, or people who are living in poorly run managed care facilities. And there's no blinding insight here. This is what cities up and down the state have been doing. It's what the governor's been doing. That's why we acquired 15,000 hotel rooms and have been mobilizing trailer parks and doing all of this kind of work. I think that we're actually kind of doing what we need to do. And so that's kind of the short term. I just think that's where we should be focusing our efforts right now. And I think that's what we're doing. And by the way, that makes me a fan of the governor's proposal to reduce the environmental regulations required to convert hotel rooms into housing units. Over the medium term and the longer term, we need to continue doing all those things that we've been talking about for the last 10 years. CEQA reform and process reform and building housing around transit stations and so on and so forth. But I think that this recent civil rights crisis has also reminded us, not that we needed to be reminded, but apparently we did, that we need to confront oppression and racism and bias wherever and whenever we see it. In the way our governments are configured, in the government agencies themselves, and in our government documents and our general plans and in our zoning codes. And that requires that we, as planners and public managers and elected officials, take an equity lens to our work. That's, I think, what we need to do now.
I want to take that theme, the infusing of equity into our work with this question, and it'll be for all of you, particularly from where you sit and operate and see. What would it mean for the region to take an equitable approach to addressing the combined impacts of COVID and the housing crisis? And I would offer at least one thing to start. I think one of the values that we had was we actually have data that has shown that COVID-19 has manifested itself shockingly in African-American communities, our Latinx communities, other communities on the margin. And we have the numbers. It's not just a supposition, it's not an anecdote. We have the actual data that is pretty irrefutable. And, so I guess I would offer, for each, and I'll start with Lorena, if it's the information that we need to, is it the information that we need to get more of? Is it how that information is communicated, how we use that information? What are your thoughts about, with equity, what we need to do to keep it front and center in the solutions that we're trying to move forward with?
to me, it's a question of values and what we value more. And that's always the battle, right? Like, it's the battle of values. When we talk about give and take and coming to some agreements, on one side of the conversation, there is loss and profit, right? On the other side of the conversation is for families to be the ones that gives or takes. That gives means they're giving up their capacity to stay in their communities. And it's not just a place to live. We have to understand that for our familias, like the people that are being directly affected by this disease and have been affected by the economic inequality that has been here for a long time, it's not just where you're going to live. It's really the capacity of raising your children, of taking care of your teens so that they're going to have an opportunity to do something more. The schools are going to go, just stability, mental health. All these things are at stake when we negotiate out who gets to stay and who gets to go. I think it's important, especially right now, honoring again the moment that we're in. Thinking about San Francisco, the first people that were housing these negotiations about who and where people get to live and for whom, the first people to be run out of my city in different ways with different strategies that made sense economically, probably, were Black people. We were a city that we were 25% Black, and now we're like hovering 3%. And you see that this inequality shows up in ways such as, if you look at who is in the street, it's 60% of Black people, even though they're 3% of the population. Who is in the SROs? 70% of them are Black. Who is in the jails? We're going again in the 80%. And so housing, it's not just about like a building or whether that's, how much money or who's going to get to live or who owns it, but it's actually an indicator of the capacity of people to live, when we talk about equity, to live their full life. So I think that really, as we move forward, we need to think about, what John Powell talks about, like the targeted universalism. The fact that we need to look at the people that are most impacted and figure out what the equity solutions are, especially to address those needs if we're going to value life first. If the negotiation is around how much profit in life, then like that's a question for us as a society. And I think that's where the sort of the battle of the ideas is at. And I have to choose life. And every single time, life is more important. And I think that that's what the governor is doing. I think that some of our local governments are doing that. And that's what we're pushing as people, because it's not fair that our children don't know where. In none of our cities, there's an imagination for children like mine, who are 12 years old right now. She has no chance, if things continue in this way, to live in San Francisco, in the city where she was born, that she claims as home. I don't know what's going to happen. So that's not a way to live. And I think that's what's at stake. And for me, that's the question. What are we going to value more?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very spot on so many levels. Conor, your thoughts. Clearly you saw the disparities and when equity is not valued in so many of the stories in your book, among other things, which was incredibly impactful. But your thoughts generally on making equity a driving force in the policies that we're trying to do in the housing space and how we do that. You're muted, Conor.
Sorry, it wouldn't be a Zoom call if your daughter didn't come in and bother you. So I turned the mute off put the mute on for a little bit there. I think that there are, what I tried to do in the book is look at this holistically and at a systems level, but then also to look at it on a personal level. And I think that we do have to acknowledge some of the systems stuff. And it's not as compelling to talk about, and it's not as galvanizing as things like, some of the more personal stories. But I guess, so I think that, anyway, so making equity a piece of this, I guess, I've always wondered about this, like, how would you do something like this and allow yourself, I guess, like a chance to experiment and see what works, but then stop it if it doesn't work, anyway, so I guess one thing we're going to have is balance. One example I bring up a lot is, if you look at the Silicon Valley, some of the jobs, housing imbalances there are, I don't know that I've seen anything like them in the nation. A place like Palo Alto has about 4-ish jobs per housing unit. Manhattan, which is sort of this, classic place where the nighttime population is so much smaller than the daytime population, and have big buildings and trains and freeways and all these things, to get bridges, to get people there just to work, has like 2.2. So, and you see things like Apple, where, in Cupertino, they built this giant new headquarters. And if you go watch the city council meeting where they approved it, everyone asked, what are we going to do with the affordable housing? What are we going to do? How can you build this massive building and not try to think about who, not only where the people are going to live who work there, but where the people are going to live who clean the houses of the people who work there and things like that. And these decisions are just never made in a holistic way. They're never made in a regional way. And so we see these huge disparities. So I guess that piece of the equity puzzle, I think is, it's not as fun, it's not as interesting to talk about as things like direct help for people. But I think that the main amount of power we have here in the Bay Area, whether we like it or not, the bulk of our political power is in what we build and what we approve, what we don't approve, I guess, and then kind of how we create balance in the region. But when you start talking about really hugely important things, like how do we make the Section 8 program 4 times the size, which is, so about a quarter of the people who are eligible for a voucher can get one. How do we build more truly affordable housing, at like 30%, right? A lot of those things are going to involve some degree of federal help, because I just don't see how we're going to have money. I mean, you're talking about like trillions, or I mean, it's not trillions, but you know what I mean? You're talking sums of money that even a state doesn't,
right.
They can get some of it. But anyway, so I think that talking about how we're going to build a regional government and think about how our region operates together is I think really important. So the story I did in the book that kind of reflected that was, and my dear friend to here, it's like Hollywood Squares, Steve over here, Steve is in a town that is on a BART stop. This is a regional resource that if you tried to rebuild it today would be, $1 billion a mile or some ridiculous sum. And there's a BART stop there, and there's a question, and many of the people in Lafayette, when you ask them, should you be able to build a housing near this stop, will say, shouldn't the people, I've heard this numerous times, and I'm sure Steve did too, shouldn't the people who live there have have some say in what kind of housing goes there. And
So
my
what
answer,
I'm going to do,
sorry.
I'm going to interrupt because
No problem.
Yeah, we have I think we can get this story in the questions, but as you might imagine, people are lining up with lots of questions for all of you. So we're going to flip to Q&A.
Yes, all I was going to say is
maybe
everyone has to
continue to
participate.
integrate this all in, and including Steve, your experiences and stories. So Leslie, are you going to offer questions and then I share them with the panel here?
Yes. So some of the questions that have come in are somewhat related, but the first one that we received was, what should the regional response be to counties that continually fail at providing their affordable housing quotas?
Okay. In fact, let me toss that to Steve. He's nodding. Steve, who, you definitely were in the middle of those decisions among others. And I'm interpreting county as county and its incorporated cities in that. Do you want to take that question? And you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Like Conor said, it's not a Zoom meeting without people forgetting to unmute themselves. There's a technical answer to the question, and that is that the regional agency has, penalties and process and so on and so forth. But I'm just going to use the question as an opportunity to say that perhaps this crisis with the income inequality and COVID and racial injustice all coming down, a recession, perhaps a depression, all coming down at once is an opportunity for a reset, for us to rethink how we govern ourselves and how we do land use and transportation policy. It's kind of crazy. We have something like 25 different transit agencies and 110 cities and counties in the Bay Area, all of which have different and independent authority, and none of which are accountable, truly accountable to any higher agency. And I just think that if we were to start from scratch, we wouldn't do it that way. And it's not a best practice. It's not how the great cities in the world have organized themselves. And if you look at the results, we have terrible traffic and horrible housing affordability. I don't think anybody would argue that the system itself, as it's currently designed, I wouldn't even say designed, as it's currently organized, is working. So perhaps this is an opportunity to have a broader conversation about how we create a regional system of governance that delivers better results.
That's been an internal question, but if we're going to reset it, this would definitely be the time. Leslie, another question?
Sure. So this one's it's one of the questions that's risen to the top, and it's specifically for Conor. Should the city have required Apple to house 20 to 30% of its workforce on site at the spaceship before approving the project?
So I try not to comment on specific things because I really, truly don't know. And I don't think it's a good idea when I start, I don't know how to put this, but when I start getting into like specifics of legislation and all that, not just because it's not my role, but also I just really don't know it well enough. But I will say this, and I will say philosophically, I'm less enthused by, so I think that the private sector has a role and the public sector has a role, right? And I think the public sector should tax the private sector to some, reasonable level that helps us take care of the challenges we need, whatever that level is, and then take care of a lot of the stuff. So I'm actually less. I don't like solutions where you're requiring a company to do something. And it's not because I'm anti-requiring the company to do something, but it's because it really ends up single peopling out. Like, Wells Fargo is a really big employer in San Francisco too. So there's a lot of big employers in San Francisco that have, or maybe not in Cupertino, right? But that have nothing to do with technology. And so my answer to the question is like, whether or not they would have required Apple specifically to build housing on their campus specifically, I don't really have a comment on that, and probably if I did have a comment, it'd be probably not a good idea. But should the city be required to provide for someone to build the housing for those people to live in, and some kind of affordable component for the, probably for the lower paid employees, like, so that the city and the surrounding cities has balance? Like, absolutely, or else you're going to get what you currently have.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. Okay, next question.
Thanks. So there are a lot of questions around the thread of the equity conversation. The next one that's risen to the top is, there are still laws on the books that are both predatory and exclusionary, like Costa-Hawkins. Primarily low-income families of color occupied these homes that were subsidized by the government. And then when it became more profitable for owners to get out of the housing business, they evicted these families, adding to displacement and the number of homeless families on the streets. There is still very strong opposition to getting rid of these types of laws. How effective do you think housing coalitions will be if we can't get legislation to back up actions to provide and protect affordable housing?
Okay, there's a lot in that question. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Steve and Lorena address it. Lorena, what I would like you to do is pick up this theme of how can communities and activists continue to become true players in the legislative arena. Because as you pointed out, earlier, you're beginning to see people showing up at city councils, showing up, at the place where the decisions are made. So in terms of changing laws, do you have a thought about or current or potential new ways for those voices to be in that space? And then I want to flip it to Stephen to ask us a different question, which is, do you have some thoughts in your long, career about how literally just to make the legal legislative decision-making process work better than it does? So Lorena, I'll start with you.
So again, this question is powerful because it all boils down to the power that we can accrue together as be it a coalition, community or whatnot, to move an idea forward in legislation, be it at the local level or at the state level. And at the end of the day, in a country like this one, I come from a place where you can't pass laws, right? It's all about who has power and money. And in the United States, we have the capacity to actually, put ballot initiatives, move, get champions at the local level to move something forward. But it really requires us to build broader and kind of like rethink what it means to be community, not just for the interest of passing a law, but it's a long-term sustained work to reweaving the fabric of our own communities. And I think that having deeper conversations and creating spaces where people, again, like homeowners, neighbors, and renters, and folks who are in the streets are starting to like show up for each other because of these deep relationships is going to be a step forward in actually moving public policy to a place where we can actually win. At the end of the day, our elected officials will move in the direction of power. And if we cannot create a counterbalance to what there is right now, then it's going to continue to go that direction. And be it at the ballot or be it at the city council, it all plays the same. So it's more than just building coalitions or building campaigns for the moment to pass a certain idea forward. But I think we really need to, and in COVID-19, what we're seeing the country rising up for right now and over time because of racism that's been here, it gives us a new opportunity to rethink what it means to become community. And that goes beyond my interest and your interest. What I see in our organizing is that, frankly, like in Daly City, you see lots of communities that are living in these single family homes, and you see a whole family, like, and that would mean grandma, grandpa, and the auntie and the uncle, and everybody lives in one home. And then tomorrow, the owner of that home can make more money selling it. So that whole maybe 15 people are trying to figure out, scrambling where they're gonna go. They go to the Central Valley. They go, or they end up in their cars. So, but their neighbors might be homeowners, and they totally known that family for 25 years. But we have not made the connection of, you know, for that neighbor that's a homeowner, understanding that Costa Hawkins repealing that would actually benefit our whole neighborhood, our whole community. That is not talked about. It's just talked as some law about housing. Like housing is a building. Again, it goes back. Housing and homes are different. And having a home, having a community is central to all of our well-being, whether you own, whether you live on the corner in your car, or you rent the house. It's about what it means to be community. We have to go back to the basics. And I think that that's when we will start to see real change that centers people as the most important.
And I think you've got that. I want, Steve, you to wrap this up for us, because unfortunately, as we all knew, there's just so much more we could talk about. But making people the center of our decision-making and our work. Do you see the legislative process being able to shape that in a way that could really exert the change?
So let me just say that, and I guess I'm going to speak to the people who I think are probably the audience that's listening here, and that's the planners and the public managers and the elected officials and my brothers and sisters in public service. This is a particularly important problem for us because our agencies have been depressingly complicit in promoting policies over the decades, such as redlining and exclusionary zoning that are discriminatory. And but we're in charge now. This is our responsibility. We make the rules for land use, and we control the funding for transportation, and we therefore decide where people will live in the future and how they will get to work and how they will do so fairly and safely and equitably and productively. And I'll just close by saying this, that if we're not actively working to correct our unfair, our inequitable, our environmentally destructive systems, then we are tacitly accepting them. And that makes us complicit. And so I just encourage people that work in this business to speak up and to use your voice and your power and your privilege to right the wrongs that are in our current systems. You know, all that's in it for you is the opportunity to say at the end of your career that you did what you could. And
that's, I think, a call to action for all of us. I want to thank our speakers, Lorena, Conor, Steve, thank Leslie and Keenan for helping us pull this incredible session together. Again, to the audience, I wish we had more time. I thank you for joining us and calling us forward to try to enact the change that today, that the past and today and certainly future calls us to do. So with that, I will turn it back over to Keenan. And again, thank you all for an amazing session.
Yes, thank you, Therese, and thank you to our panelists, and thanks to all our audience members for joining us on today's Metro Talks. We'll be posting a recording of this session and sharing them out with everyone who registered. Please remember to complete the follow-up survey you'll find in your inboxes, letting us know how we can improve Metro Talks and make suggestions for future topics. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.